right, speaker one, be ready when you are.
August 2nd, 2018. A man was able to strap 2 plastic explosives onto a drone and fly it into President Maduro's rally. If he just spent a few more hours learning how to pilot the drone a little bit better, if he just tilted his joystick a little bit to the right, Maduro would be dead and Venezuela would be in shambles. Proposition stance is very clear. We think drones cause an unacceptable and unnecessary degree of harm, and a ban, and only a ban, is able to reduce, if not completely eliminate, any of the negative externalities that civilian uses of drones can operate. 3 arguments in my speech and 1 more in Jenna's. First, I'll be explaining to you why the amount of harm that drones can cause drastically outweigh any good they're able to bring about to us, and this alone is able to justify a ban. Secondly, any attempt at regulation becomes nigh impossible, if not counterproductive. Finally, drones erodes the fundamental trust between individual members inside of a community, something we think is unacceptable. Jenna will begin to explain to you why. The instant when drones become part of the industry, the instant there are now market incentives to continue to develop them, this creates more negative outcomes. What is a ban on the civilian use of drones? We are banning total sale on drones, small, maneuverable, and presumably fast vehicles that are able to record from civilians, meaning your average person, meaning any organization or commercial firm. First argument, why the harm presented by drones is able to justify a ban and why any harm is unacceptable. Firstly, we tell you inherently, regardless of how you use drones, you must violate privacy. A drone is essentially a camera with wings. The instant an anonymous man is able to pilot one from several kilometers away to fly past your bedroom window to watch you changing, showering, and conducting things that otherwise would have been left alone in the privacy of your own homes, we think this constitutes a fundamental assault on your own privacy. This is the exact reason why we've seen communities in Minnesota have vocal outcry for the continuous and complete ban of any use of civilian drones altogether. When mothers are afraid that perverts or teenage delinquents are able to watch their teenage girls and teenage daughters shower, this is a fully legitimate concern that everyone in the public should be aware of. Second harm, smuggling. We've seen instances in the status quo already when drones are a relatively fledgling industry, like when gangs like the Yakuza gang in Japan are able to smuggle drugs across the city relatively undetected since drones are fast, stealthy, and maneuverable. We've seen prisoners in El Salvador attempt to smuggle contraband into prison using the very same methods. Drones are oftentimes able to evade police scanners and evade police detection since they're so fast and it's so hard to trace a drone to an anonymous controller several miles away. Finally, and the worst case scenario, terrorism. I've already told you about the attempted assassination attempt on Maduro's life. If a man in Wisconsin, in the status quo, is already able to rig a gun's firing system to his own drone, if we've already seen Houthi rebels attempt to use drones to dive bomb Saudi radio stations in an attempt to disrupt communications, it's not long before we potentially see something like terrorists attempting to use a single drone to fly into the Super Bowl stadium in an attempt to spread a biological agent, if not set off a bomb. Drones allow for individual lone wolves or radical organizations to cause an unacceptable degree of harm that otherwise would not have been tolerated. Final reason why drones present an unacceptable amount of harm. We tell you the exact same characteristics that make a drone appealing for civilians is the same reason why a drone would be appealing towards a criminal. If you use a drone to engage in, say, bird watching, your drone needs to be stealthy to not alert the bird. It needs to be fast, it needs to be small. These are the exact same characteristics that a terrorist, that someone who uses a drone to peep, someone who uses a drone for illegal activity would want. Since drones would likely develop in this direction, this is a negative externality. Insofar as I've proven to you that drones constitute an unacceptable amount of harm, all I need to prove to you now that a ban is the best course of action to remove this negative externality. Yes?
Are drones a necessary factor, a necessary prerequisite to terrorists committing these actions?
Sure, we accept that drones can produce some benefits. Sure, terrorists can find other ways to, say, set up a bomb inside of a parliament, but drones make it far too easy and lower the barrier of entry far too much for them to do so. That's our stance. Second argument, why regulation becomes nigh impossible if you attempt to regulate the use of drones. We tell you fundamentally, regulations is far too slow and far too ineffective. It is only after the attempted assassination attempt on Maduro's life that Venezuela has only begun to have things like talks on what laws should we implement in order to regulate the amount of drone usage. If an attempt on your president's life is the only catalyst needed to start, say, any talks at all, it's not unreasonable to assume that the only time when public realizes that a ban is the best course of action is when, say, the British House of Parliament gets blown up. Every time a regulation is put in place, it is reactive. A ban is preemptive, and a reactive regulation incurs a human cost, like dead children, like people getting peeped on, that we are unwilling to tolerate. Second reason why regulations become nigh impossible. We tell you it's very difficult to assign blame. It's very hard to trace the frequency of a drone back to its remote control several miles, if not 10 years later, in another country away. Considering how someone, for example, if you see a drone being used to spy on you, it's very hard to say, I know exactly whose drone it is, even though they may be tens of hundreds of miles away. If your neighbor, conversely, attempts to, say, use a camera to record you from across your lawn, it's immediately identifiable who exactly is spying on you, who exactly is violating your privacy. It's extremely difficult to assign blames towards anyone who attempts to use drones for nefarious purposes. And even if you are able to assign blame, it's far easier to do things like forge a drone license to say, I'm a civilian who's using it for good purposes, than attempt to say, oh no, I don't even have a drone at all, while trying to hide one behind your back when you're under police questioning. Final reason why regulation is not impossible. We tell you the immediate functions that a drone requires in order to become deadly, meaning the drone's ability to take photos and record and the drone's ability to fly, is things that is nigh impossible to regulate around. Unless Team China somehow has force fields or anything of the like, they cannot prevent drones from attempting to cross into certain areas, like above people's homes, attempt to prevent drones from flying above people in an attempt to record them, or an attempt to stop drones from flying near important places, like religious churches, like religious synagogues, or near members of parliament, or near the White House. It's extremely difficult to stop drones from flying. That's where they're most dangerous, and it's even harder to attempt to stop drones from doing things like recording, unless Team China supports any measure that allows governments to see what drones are exactly recording. No more POIs. Final argument, how exactly the use of drones erodes trust between communities. We tell you, it's understandable and perfectly reasonable for people to feel fearful of a flying camera that is able to spot you by an anonymous person from miles and miles away. Especially when people believe that either regulation is failing because they see drones hovering around them all the time, or if people know regulation is failing since I've told you all the reasons why regulation doesn't work. When a father is understandably concerned that every time he sees a drone pass by his daughter's bedroom, he doesn't know whether or not the drone is being either unintentionally used to see if his daughter is changing, or intentionally used by teenage delinquents to catch her changing. This is especially harmful when people and communities no longer trust each other. Even if a drone is being used for benign purposes, it's extremely difficult to tell if the drone right behind your back is trying to record you in an attempt to collect blackmail, or if the drone behind your back is simply only being used to record, say, a cool YouTube video. Because people are so fearful of drones, because they erode trust between members of the community so easily, since it's so easy to use them to record and follow someone in an attempt to violate the privacy. We already see people attempting to use guns to shoot them down once they attempt to go near their homes. Because the type of fear drones are able to inspire is so harmful, because people already try to shoot them down, we think an erosion of trust is something we're not willing to accept. Drones constitute an unbelievable and unacceptable amount of harm. A ban is the best course of action. Proud to be
Thank you, Speaker 1. We'll go for 8 minutes, 15 seconds.
That day, the specific terrorist used a drone. He could have used a robot to strap a bomb onto it and send it into the crowd. He could have strapped it on a toy car and sent it to a crowd as well. Then the proposition team, following their own logic about how there can be weaponization of this specific tool, will be having a conversation about banning toy cars in today's debate. We tell you that logic does not make sense, because anything in our world can be used to be weaponized, can be manipulated to create harm. That doesn't mean it is justified to completely ban it, because it's not the inherent harm of the object that creates this type of damage. Before moving on to our stance and our constructives, two rebuttals for them first. Firstly, on the point about privacy, 3 things to say about this. Firstly, we can limit certain areas to say these places you cannot go, for instance, private homes and stuff like that. Regulations can already control the issue of privacy. It is not something inherent to the use of drones. But second of all, we already punish you if you videotape a girl taking a shower, if you violate someone's privacy and property rights by going into their homes and try to take recordings of certain things. There's already deterrence of the law. We don't understand why when they add one more legislation, one more law with the exact same punishments, these criminals will suddenly be deterred from doing the same actions. If they're not deterred right now with the same punishments, they won't change in their paradigm. But thirdly, if they truly care about privacy, then it makes me wonder why they're only banning civilian use, right? Because governments can still use drones to use as surveillance cameras to spy on our daily lives, violating our privacy. So we doubt that this is their true intention when they tell you they want to ban the use of drones, because they're only targeting civilian use, but not bigger corporations that can use it against their lawyers, or use it against their workers, or even governments who can use it against their citizens. This doesn't make sense. But secondly, their point is about the erosion of trust. We don't understand why this point even exists. Because when I put up surveillance cameras in my own home, that can also erode the trust between me and my neighbors when they can see that I think they're sketchy or I think they're harmful to my house. But that doesn't mean I don't have the right to make this choice. This is up to the civilians whether or not they want to build a trusty relationship between them and their neighbors and their community. This should be a choice of the civilians, and they should be doing this calculus, not the government telling you you don't have the right to do so. The same analogy works with surveillance cameras. These points fall. The rest of the rebuttals will be integrated in our constructive, but firstly onto our stance and our model. Our stance is incredibly clear. There are benefits and disadvantages depending on the potential uses of drones. What we support is limiting the safety concerns while still reaping the benefits by using regulations, and this way we can access the benefits while avoiding the harms. We have a 3-point model. Firstly, qualifications. We think this is pretty analogous to driver's license. We're using the FAA system where you have to be more than 18 years old, you take a written test, you take a course on what is a responsible use of drones, and you cannot have any criminal records. After you acquire a license, you can purchase your drone, but with your drone it's going to have GPS tracking from the government, it's going to have backdoor override from the government, it's going to have a license plate that you have to use or else government will shoot down your drone. This means we can assign blame because we're essentially connecting you with the GPS tracker, with your ID, all of these things to make sure we can assign blame. If they tell you this is not plausible, we think they cannot defend that, because when they're saying they're going to ban, they're banning, they probably have to identify the drone and punish them if you're actually using it, right? Or else there's no way of enforcing the ban either. They have to retrieve the drones, which means they have to be able to track the drones somehow for the ban to even work on their side of house. So we think it is a caveat to say we can implement these policies of tracking the drones and controlling them, or else banning or regulations will not work, and this debate does not exist. Second of all, we support laws restricting the weight of the drone, the altitude, and the area in which you can fly to, which means airports, private homes are things that are not off limits for this debate. You have to occupy it in a safe space where there's potentially only a field or scenery and you can't hit anything. We think this is something we can defend. Thirdly, the punishment is going to be similar to driving, which means if you have a small offense, we remove your license, potential fines. But if it's a big offense, you have to go to jail time and stuff like that, and we'll shoot down if you disregard any of the rules above. We think banning inherently is a violation of the fundamental civilian rights of freedom of choice regarding their daily lives, regarding what they can use, and you remove all possibilities of using this tool in any positive way possible. Which means that if you ever want to justify banning something, there has to be a high criteria in which you can do so. You must prove why, one, there's significant and unmitigatory harm, specifically from civilian use in this case, and second of all, why ban will work in solving the problem. Then we think when anything can be weaponized, from kitchen knives to cars to even a toy car, if you strap a bomb onto it, then we think it is not sufficient for them to say there has been instances where drones cause harm, but they need to prove this high criteria in which you say there's always going to harm regarding civilian use of drones, and that is the point in which they can ban this type of usage. Sure.
The difference between a toy car and a drone is that while you probably spot a toy car approaching, you can't see a drone because it's so speedy, it's so stealthy, and by the time it's hit you, it's too late.
Then I can also build like a really speedy robot in this case. Would you ban robotics from the world too? I can use dark web instead of or I can use the website and communicate with people. We just don't think you can track all these things just because drones are speedy and are high tech. For instance, higher speed cars, they can be used to create more damage than cars too. Doesn't mean you have to stop development of these things, but I will address this. So let's just move on. Let's address all the harms on their side of house and tell you why we can solve it better, or they can't solve it either. Firstly, uninformed choice for instance, if you like accidentally flew the drone into a place where you're not supposed to because of the lack of control, that is why we have the education system to tell you what is responsible use and give you the skills you need to actually use it responsibly. Second of all, irrational users who are just rogue, then we tell you that these are the people with bad intent, then we just scope them out with the license system, right? This is not about all civilians being rogue and using the drones in a bad way. It's about certain people who already have bad intentions. Then we tell you that they won't have this access to the drones and license in the first place. But thirdly, about violence and terrorists, right? We think violence and terrorists, they don't really solve that on their side of the house either, because these people always go through other means to achieve the same goals. We can solve a terrorist attack even if we don't have access to bombs or guns or knives. As long as we have the bad intention to create harm, we will find other tools to do it. For instance, drones have been used for the German Pirate Party to attack Angela Merkel for political reasons or traffic drugs. These are their ends. Drones are merely a means that they found. Then if that is their end, they will find other means to achieve the same goal with other measures. They can either get other technologies or second of all, build their own drones, which terrorists do anyways, because drones in the market, they don't have the size or the capability to put a bomb on there and like be in the control. They have to build their own drones anyways, and that is the status quo, which is why we tell you that terrorists won't change any of their actions on their side of house. Now their defense is that, well, it's easier and more accessible for them to have drones. Well, the thing is, if you take this away from them, they'll create something even easier and more convenient for them. An analogy of this was the internet. They originally used social media to communicate between terrorists, and then the government could track that, so they couldn't use the internet. That's how they developed the dark web and like other connections that are even harder to track. Just because you get rid of one means doesn't mean you'll limit all of their actions, and we tell you they're only going to develop a better technology for you to be impossible to track. This is exactly why the harms are only exacerbated on their side of house. Because on our side of house, we acknowledge that both sides are going to have people with exceptions. Both sides are going to have people who are rogue and will use drones in a bad ways. What we do is that we accept that these people exist in society. We build the infrastructure instead of, like they say, avoid the problem, saying that there's a point blank ban so that no drone will ever exist in the house. We tell you that when we have the registry system, when we have the backdoor, the information about the demographics of people who actually use these drones, we're more equipped to actually shoot down these drones or protect our civilians. We think this is the more reasonable case. We also tell you that civilians are mostly responsible users because terrorist organizations do these harms, political parties do these harms. When you see civilians using drones, you see them mostly using it for leisure, for cinematography, or fun reasons. They don't just go out there and become a terrorist individually. These are all usually organized by groups. So we tell you that that's actually against their point when they only target civilian usage and banning that from the society. We tell you that the example that's equivalent to this is about gun ownership, right? We see extremists who are using guns like shoot. Even if you ban the guns or you don't ban the guns, they're still going to do this because extremists are not deterred by the law and they go for the actions anyways. But the people who use it for guns for civilians are usually using it for defense purposes. They usually don't go out there and proactively harm people. They just keep it as a security, keep it as a safety net. Then we tell you that they don't do much harm to society, and that is why they can't ban civilians from using something rationally. People who actually do damage with guns is the military, the government, the big organizations like the terrorist organizations, and these are the people that they exactly are not targeting. So we're telling you that banning is the worst way to go about this. You limit the most vulnerable individuals that actually don't do any harm with this technology, and you get rid of all possibilities for us to acquire benefits before even trying other steps of limiting the use of drones first. So proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 20 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, if side opposition genuinely believes that the harms imposed by a drone are equivalent to the harms imposed by a toy car, we think that they've walked into the wrong debate. So I'll be looking at this debate first off in terms of rebuttal under two main questions. First off, whether or not we ban things when things are too harmful and what those harms of drones are. And secondly, whether or not regulations are enough to actually mitigate those harms to a satisfactory extent. And then after that, I'll be jumping into substantive on why we think the fact that when you make drones something that you put on the market, something that you buy and sell as a product, the harms that you impose to things like criminals and things like terrorists get so much worse on their side of the house. So first off, let's take a look at exactly how rebuttal breaks down in this debate. Because we think that the key issue that we had with side opposition's first speech was that we heard almost zero direct response to the 7 minutes of analysis that we gave you from our P1. everything that they responded to was either unresponsive and completely disregarded all the nuanced analysis that we gave to you about the inherent nature of drones and why it is therefore so difficult to regulate, or secondly, they simply conflated it with a similar idea and said, hey, we do this with other things too, and therefore we don't have to respond to your ideas in the first place. And I'll be looking at exactly why this strategy of responsiveness was so devastating to their case in a moment. So first off, let's take a look at the harms of drones and whether or not we would ever therefore ban it. Because we think that side opposition completely agrees that in some cases, drones are used for malicious activity, they are used for things like terrorism, things like pervert stalking on teenagers. We think in these cases they accept that harm does exist and therefore that some type of action, whether that be regulation or whether that be a ban, does have to take place. But the question then comes up on when they would ever ban it, because their only piece of analysis that they gave us as to why they would not ban it was basically saying that anything can be used as a weapon. A toy car and a drone are basically the same thing. We don't think that this is actually the case. We think that if side opposition were to say that toy cars and robots were to become one thing and then were to suddenly develop into something like tanks, we think that those are two completely different things. The point at which it develops into something that it can be so easily militarized, something that is so incredibly difficult to regulate against, and something that individuals have no power to defend themselves against, we think that that is the point at which the government should step in, that is the point at which we should ban things. We would ask side opposition if, through their own logic, anything can be weaponized and therefore nothing should ever be banned, if they would ever ban things like citizens owning things like tanks, like citizens owning things like guns, because, hey, anything can be used as a weapon. But moreover, we think that because we are going to restrict these things from civilians, we think that there's a clear distinction between restricting it from civilians and restricting it from the government. We think that on one hand, the government is much more accountable and has fewer incentives to do things like stalk teenagers. We think that moreover, through that same logic, we trust the government to handle things like the military, to handle things like guns and chemicals and other superior weapons, whereas we take those things away from civilians and we take those things away from civilian-run organizations, whether that be companies or political parties as well. We're perfectly happy to stand against taking away all those things, as our first speaker mentioned in setup. But secondly, let's look at whether or not regulation is sufficient, because our first speaker gave some pretty heavy analysis as to why drones are so uniquely and inherently impossible to regulate. We talked about how it's not enough to simply see whether or not a drone is flying through your window because it has 3D access, so simply not letting it within a certain radius might not be enough for a sufficient camera of sufficient quality. The cases where no one actually really knows what a drone is doing, and it's therefore impossible to actually go and get that arrest warrant, impossible to go and arrest that person in the first place. Where moreover in cases where you have people like drones being unmanned. So even if you do try to actually track down these drones using GPS systems, etc., it is so easy for people to just ditch their drones in whatever field it crashed in and simply leave it there and run. Where it is so difficult to tie people to what their drones do, to actually track down what people are doing with those drones, that we think that it is unacceptable for side opposition to put down these weak regulations and say, hey, we think that that should be roughly enough. We think that moreover, because drones are so versatile, because they can be modified in the privacy of one's own home to do things like have pistols or have bombs attached to them, we think that letting these things get through the cracks is unacceptable. We understand that there are some people who use drones for perfectly benevolent reasons, who use it to do things like photography and cinematography and simply relax. We think that that is perfectly fine. But we think the benefits that we get from there are so small compared to the harms that we get when people slip through the cracks of regulation, when license and background checks actually fail once in a while. We think that the harms that can be imposed in those cases is not enough for side opposition to be able to stand in this debate. Now let's take a look at my substantive in this debate on why we think that market demand actually means that terrorists and crime actually gets worse. Because we think that first off, do-it-yourself drones that you make at home as a terrorist is going to be so much is going to be of a much lower quality compared to drones that you are able to get when you have like high-end investors pouring a lot of money into developing drones and making that into a much more viable solution when it's on the market, when it's public, when people are investing into it. We think that therefore to have it on the market is much more likely to lead to much worse drones than the drones we might get on our side of the house. We think that as the market is quite large right now and is only increasing, we think that this type of large market means that there are huge financial incentives for companies to do exactly the types of things that criminals want. Where you have civilians and criminals wanting pretty much the same thing from their drones. You want them to be fast so that you can do things like drone races. You want them to be flexible so you can attach more cameras or more weapons if you're a terrorist to them. You want them to have a longer battery life. You want them to be quicker and stealthier and make less noise. We think that the benefits that civilians derive are inherently tied to the harms that criminals are able to do. We think that because criminals then on their side of the house have better access to better technology, better things to do spying or terrorist acts with, we think that as a result of letting the market thrive, we think that that is hugely damaging. Well, moreover, however, we think that there are two reasons why this type of market function is unique to drones and not just to all technology in general. We think that first off, because of the market, we think that things like stealth are likely to increase, making it harder to track down illegal drones and regulate them. But moreover, we think that uniquely drones, because drones are things that can be modified in the privacy of one's home, and therefore are bought in those homes with unknown purposes, it's hard to regulate. But secondly, because drones are unmanned, because they're remotely operated, you can very easily plant a bomb onto a drone, fly it through someone's apartment complex and leave it to detonate without any harm to the criminal, with it being very, very difficult to tie back. We think that those are harms that are unique to drones and unique to that type of technology that we don't want to put on the market. So overall, we think that that means that drones are inherently hard to regulate preventatively because no one knows what you're doing with that drone, no one knows how you're going to modify it privately. And secondly, because of things like markets where you are allowed them to turn it into a product that people buy and sell, it's harder to stop the sociopaths that you can't detect with background checks. We think that moreover there's a second impact to this. It's not just the fact that you're unable to regulate these drones, but secondly we think you get to things like arms races, where governments feel the need to develop better and better drones to track down increasingly well-developed and better, more technological drones that criminals have. We think that in these cases where you have the market driving that type of arms race, you're going to escalate the deadliness of a weapon that walks the streets. We think that it's important to note that in order for side opposition to regulate this, it would have to regulate this type of market to a ridiculous extent in order to mitigate all of those harms. We think that by the point they do that, we think that they're already encroaching on huge amounts of the private market, encroaching on huge amounts of individuals' freedom to research and develop what they want. And we think by that point, opposition will then have conceded huge grounds of their debate. We think that they would end up losing out on the benefits that they think civilians are able to derive from drones, especially those that are unique to civilian or private drones. We think that for these reasons, because side opposition has not responded to a huge amount of the analysis, talking about community trust breaking down, talking about things like regulations inherently being reactive and needing a crisis in order to make them happen, and because we think that side opposition would either stand for a world where anyone is allowed to do anything or would have to stand for side proposition, we are so, so proud to preach it.
Drones can be used for some fairly terrible things. We admit that occasionally you can see drones being used for terror, you can see drones being used to invade other people's privacy. However, these unique as well as exceptional cases in which drones are manipulated are not sufficient reasons for to ban drones, which is our stance in this debate. Let me talk about three things in today's debate. First of all, why exactly regulation will ultimately be effective as well as efficient. Secondly, a cost-benefit analysis of the harms as well as benefits which were neglected in this debate so far, and why exactly it doesn't mandate a ban in this case. And third and finally, the actor of the government, which we think has also not been included in this debate thus far. Firstly, why is that regulation will ultimately be efficient and effective? What we hear from proposition is a few things. The first line of analysis coming from the Prime Minister is the idea that you only had discussion or talks about drones only after your president almost got assassinated. We think this is a highly irrelevant piece of analysis, considering that it's about whether or not talks can exist. Considering we are having this debate right now, we think the talks can start now, ultimately can result in a decision that supports regulation over banning. We don't think that this piece of analysis is relevant. So the second thing to tell us is the idea that things are anonymous. And this is sufficient reason for you being unable to regulate drones in the first place. We say that if you're able to ban drones, or if you're able to forcibly take back every person's drones, we think at the same time you're also able, as a government, to forcibly take back their drones, but then also at the same time to register them on some sort of government database to ensure that you have government trackers inside this databases, and also to ensure that you know who these drones belong to. We think this ultimately solves a lot of the problems regarding anonymity as to whether you know who owns these drones or not, but sure.
Would you do things like ban civilians from owning rocket launchers or tanks?
We think that is a very different thing, although we generally think that you civilians are able, if you get a license, that you can own a helicopter, you can own a tank, but only given that you pass certain requirements as well as licenses to be able to do so. We think that is largely irrelevant in today's debate. But continuing on why registering or all of these will ultimately be more effective, considering that you're able to know the information about who owns this drone and thereby be able to implement these things. But let's also take this opportunity to talk about their analysis on why drones can be too fast and too small, and thereby you're unable to regulate these. So we think that this is indeed true in certain cases. We think that in certain cases it is indeed true that your drones may be very, very fast. However, there are two problems with this. Firstly, is that the necessary requirements for terrorism and necessary requirements for crime are very, very different from what civilians use. We think it is an exaggerated similarity between what civilians need inside their daily lives and what terrorists need in order to be able to succeed. Sure, you need a very fast drone to be able to catch track runners who are running on the track right now and be able to film them. But we also think that the speed is very, very different from the type of speed that you need to be able to evade cutting-edge government technology and government sensors from being able to see your drone in the first place. Thus, thereby, even when there is a similarity in these characteristics and similarities inside these traits, this doesn't mean that simply having civilian drones on the market ultimately means that you have terrorists being able to access same cutting-edge technology that the government will be unable to defend against. We think that what the market ultimately will provide to civilians, and in the case that these terrorists choose to take from the legitimate markets, is very different and will be able to be registered by the government. But also, secondly, let's talk about the type of drones that terrorists actually do have. We think that in these cases, there are cases in which like perhaps when you're trying to smuggle things across borders, we have indeed very fast drones. Thereby we question though, inside these cases, if a government is unable to do the most basic thing of tracking or identifying these drones, we question whether a ban itself would be ultimately effective at all. We think the most effective solution inside this case is to have the government to improve your technology to be able to detect these drones inside the first place. We think you can still do these things on their side, considering that all you're doing is banning civilian drones that you're capable of detecting and capable of putting down. If you're incapable of doing it, having neither a ban nor regulation will be able to work, and thereby it's out of this debate. But you seem to disagree. Sure.
To elaborate on Jenna's example, although it's pretty rare for an average person to get their hands on a rocket launcher, although the person can use a pistol to kill someone instead, the reason why we can't buy rocket launchers is just because they cause an unnecessary and unacceptable harm. Why does this logic not apply to drones?
Yeah, actually, let's elaborate this on my second point, which I will later get into. Right. So continuing on more layers of analysis about regulations. We think regulation also works in most cases concerning civilians, considering that most civilians, the average person is a law-abiding citizen who doesn't want to be arrested, and also are within the confines of regulation as well as the paradigms of the state. If you're talking about the common person, not just the terrorist, but the common civilian, we think in most of these cases, regulation as well as rules are able to work. But then furthermore, we also see the development of newer technologies that are able to defend against these increased technology for drones. As technology for drones increases, we also see a similar growth in the ability of governments to be able to defend against them. We see these in things like geofencing, where you cut off specific areas where drones can enter. We'll also see examples like algorithms, which if you reach a certain height, then these drones will be shut down. We think these are all examples whereby technology is able to effectively reduce this. So second major area, the cost-benefit analysis. We think that there are three things in this approach. Firstly, the idea of how there's only exceptional costs, and all of these exceptional costs are often very minimal. If you look at the example of privacy, Jack already told you why counter-privacy is already currently established as an issue. Also, secondly, we see that it is unlikely for you to, on their idea about erosion of trust, it is unlikely even the status quo for you to have such suspicions towards your neighbors. Simply having drones being able to be used by civilians doesn't mean that you immediately suspect your neighborhood grandma to be suspected of trying to spy on you. We think in the current status quo, what we see is that communities often already have tighter bonds and don't suspect each other in such a way. We think there are only extreme minorities in which there are cases and do not really matter whether you have drones or not, since they're going to happen on either way. Secondly, on the idea of smuggling as well as terrorism, right? Drones that are used in these instances are commonly not found in the market or found in our market, found in Walmart, or found in our common supermarkets in the first place. They have to be oftentimes heavy to be able to carry bombs, or etc. They also oftentimes have to have technology that civilian drones do not have, as we already earlier explained. So ultimately, even if you do ban these drones, they will be able to get it from outside sources, for example, the black market. As long as there's still demand for these instances, there's still demand for these high caliber equipment, high caliber military technology, we think there'll still be a military and an underground market supplying these weapons. We think this ultimately is not what is being regulated or what is being banned when you talk about civilian drones, but rather the fact that there are a lot of terrorist organizations or even locals have access to and have the money to be able to buy these more expensive sorts of drones. We think this is where banning itself is going to be ineffective. But then even if this is the case, we think the question isn't whether drones inherently are a problem. This is why we don't ban kitchen knives, even though you can choose with a kitchen knife to stab or to cook food or to cut an apple. it is dependent on how it is being used, even though it has great potential for great harm. On the other hand, we do ban uranium because there is extreme harm in this. It is radioactive and is highly disruptive on its own. This is what a drone is like. So Jackie were talking about how there are rogue actors. Civilians as responsible groups can choose to use these drones in different ways. Most civilians, as we already stated, are likely to use drones in a way that is not disruptive towards society as a whole. So moving on to the last piece of extension, the government. We think the government has been increasingly defamiliarized with science and with technology. This is where the American Senate doesn't really know how Facebook makes money. This is where the Japanese chief of technology minister doesn't know how to use a computer. We think in these cases where you simply have a blanket policy that bans anything or any technology that appears to be dangerous, this is a dangerous precedent for how you treat technological issues inside the 21st century. In the 21st century, where technology is increasingly prevalent, where it is often has higher potential for harm, we think that having the idea that you can only ban these items instead of trying to regulate or combat them is a terrible idea and a terrible form of discourse to have, especially in the world that we are currently living in. For all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes, 12 seconds.
Team opposition. They openly said that they support a world where as long as they have a license, citizens can own rocket launchers, tanks, and literal killer robots. The problem here is that it's not as simple as, if I want one, I should have one. The incentives that people have for owning these things are often because they want to use them. And furthermore, if even 1 amongst 10 of them chooses to use this kind of dangerous weaponry, we consider the opportunity cost unacceptable. We live in a world where regulation is necessary, and we think that drones definitely fit the criterion for them. So the first clash in today's debate is, does the harm of drones merit a ban? Team opposition's framework is that drones are a tool, they're not inherently bad, and therefore we shouldn't ban them because it's all dependent on intent. They gave us examples of toy cars and lives, which can potentially cause harm, but often don't because people use them in different ways. We think that this criterion isn't really legitimate, doesn't apply to drones, because guns, for example, and morphine can often also not cause that kind of direct harm. I can easily use a gun to hunt and shoot deer in a forest, for example, but we ban guns anyways because we recognize that they make the nature of killing categorically different. From taking a knife and stabbing someone to being able to pull a trigger and have someone 50 yards away die. We think that in the same way, a drone is important because it transforms the nature of security so differently, because it makes it so easy to do things such as take a video of someone 50 kilometers away, or do things such as target someone when you're holding a remote far, far away. We think that at the point at which drones have transformed security as opposed to just act as one tool amongst many, we think that we must ban them because they dramatically elevate the level of harm that they can cause. But furthermore, what we would say is that drones are becoming more and more dangerous is a thing that they've also failed to take into account. Jenna told you quite clearly that the nature of drones is that civilian demand for speed, for stealth, and for accuracy also make drones far more deadly as a weapon or as a tool of smuggling or of peeping. We think for all of these reasons, we ought to preempt against these looming and approaching harms that are growing greater by the day and take action to prevent harm before it grows too strong. For these reasons, we think that the harm incurred by drones is unique, unlike other tools, and deserves a ban so we prevent the unique harm that they can cause. But second of all, we think the second clash that I'm going to talk about is whether drones are enough to limit these harms. So they have a detailed model which includes things such as having people be educated on what's responsible drone use, pass a test to show they're competent to deal one, and register to a system and have a license plate, that kind of thing. Look, all of these things are great in theory, but the problem is enforcement just doesn't work. Right now, for example, people have to pass tests in order to learn to drive, and yet still terrorists use vans to commit horrific attacks on people. It's far easier to lie on a test or to understand how a drone works than pretend to use it badly. We don't think that drones do anything to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. But second of all, on their idea of registering, look, knowing that someone is part of a system doesn't mean that they cannot use a drone to create gross harm. The only action they can take if someone's registered is retroactive, to punish them after they've already made a mistake, as opposed to prevent them from causing that harm in the first place. But furthermore, we think it's incredibly easy for someone to do something like build their own drone and not get it registered, or to do things such as dismantle the GPS or the tracking on their drone. We think it's far easier intuitively to hack into a system built by a government, which is often lagging far behind private developers who are driven to improve by competition, than to build your own drone from scratch. And we think that for those reasons, you still get incredible harm. But finally, it's just hard to tell when a drone is regulated and to shoot it down from the skies. Because sure, they might have a license plate, but when one is zooming past at 100 miles per hour, you're not going to be able to read the license plate, and by the time you register the drone, it's likely to have flown far away anyways. But then for these reasons, you're likely to have huge amounts of unregistered drones just flying around out of the government's control. I'll be generous here. Like, they tell us that, well, we'll have cutting-edge government technology to prevent drones to shoot down drones and limit their activity. Calling something cutting edge doesn't make it effective, because one, they themselves concede in their 30-second extension that the government is right now woefully technologically incompetent and lagging behind private sector developers. But we think it's woefully naive for them to assume that the government's going to be able to create the kind of neuroscience force fields that are able to prevent a privately developed drone from getting where it wants, when it wants. But second of all, even if we accept that they have, like, predator drones, which can catch up to private drones and take them out, we think that the nature of drones as a machine that moves not in 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions, means it's incredibly difficult to catch one and hunt one down. The fact of the matter is, it's easier to build stealth than to build machinery that can combat stealth. And we also regret the fact that this kind of competition is going to lead to an arms race. At the point at which you have civilian drones trying to out-stealth each other, trying to get past the protection that one drone has, is the point at which you have drones becoming incredibly good at avoiding detection, incredibly good at becoming more and more accurate. We think this is the kind of technology that is specifically designed for terrorists at some point, and we don't want that kind of development to happen. But finally, their idea is that, well, intent matters, right? Because if someone's violent and wants to commit crime, even if they don't have a drone, it won't stop them. They'll build their own drone, or they'll use a toy car and strap explosives to that instead. Like, first note that they're only really willing to talk about terrorism in this instant. Because sure, someone might be really convinced about their desire to perpetuate global jihad, but the average peep, or the average person who wants to do some smuggling, is unlikely to feel that same kind of urge and circumvent laws on drone possession. So we think that we'll be able to limit access in that regard. But furthermore, we think it's far easier to do things such as, we think it's far better if they're forced to build their own drones, or to use an alternative mechanism. Because the drones that they build may be difficult to detect, but it's not like under their world, terrorist leaders are going to sign their drones up to be registered on our government network anyways. And furthermore, it's far harder to build a drone as competent and as advanced as the ones we'll have on our side when we have huge MNCs putting all their technological expertise into building drones than if you have to put one together in your home, in your garage. And furthermore, we encourage a world where they're forced to use things that aren't drones, because we think that they're much less likely to be fast, they're much less likely to be accurate, and to avoid detection. We think that we vastly increase the probability that we're able to catch attacks if terrorists are unable to use something as speedy as drones. But finally, on the idea of general quality of life, the first thing I'd like to note is that they're incredibly vague on what benefits they actually think drones have. Because if they want to perform cost-benefit analysis, it's not enough to say that, well, people should just have a right to own drones. And we think that for those reasons, you should ban them even though they have massive harms. Their failure to bring something positive to the table means that the way up is really just pitched in our favor from the get-go. But furthermore, we did tell you something about the quality of life in general. We told you about the decrease in trust in the community, and we told you that the point at which you're hovering metal objects that you have no way of saying who it's from, and you have no idea of knowing whether it's looking at me or looking at someone else, means that you just build paranoia and insecurity within communities. Their only rebuttal to that was, well, communities are really tight-knit anyways. One, not all of them are, and two, even if they are the status quo, that doesn't mean that they will be in the future when you inject the paranoia and fear about drones that you can't control into the mix. For all of these reasons, Because team opposition has never given us a reason for why drones are so desirable, the motion goes to team opposition. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 15 seconds.
Judge, if you read the motion, it's not a debate about whether drones are good or are they bad. It's whether we actually need to ban them. And we told you from the first speech that a potential for harm does not constitute a necessity for ban. Because by that logic, a knife, the sharper it is, the easier it is for me to cut fruit. But also, the easier it is for me to kill someone with a knife. So therefore, we should ban knives. A table, the harder it is, the more rigid it is, and therefore the easier it is for me to write on it, but also the easier it is for me to bonk someone on the head with it and then kill that person. So therefore, we should ban tables. Phones, the larger battery storage you have and the better camera you have, the better of a phone it is. But also, there's a larger potential for you to spy on someone with that phone, so we should also ban phones. Okay, cars. The faster the car is, and the more metal you have around that car, the safer it is for you, but also the more dangerous it is if you crash into someone with that car. Under their paradigm, under their own analysis, they have to ban all of these things. But also, we're going to tell you that just because you don't have such a large benefit, doesn't mean that you should ban those things. Because diamonds don't have that much of a benefit either, but we don't ban them, simply because there's not that much of a harm. So we don't, no thank you, we don't ban chewing gum, what we said in Singapore, we don't ban chewing gum because there's not that much of a harm in chewing gum. Ultimately, I'm going to give you a very quick clarification before my 3 questions. So what are the criteria of a ban? First, they have to prove that regulation doesn't work. The second, they have to prove that there is extreme harm without benefit, or they have to tell you that this type of tool is explicitly used as harming other individuals. And also, they have to prove to us why this ban is ultimately going to work and decreasing the amount of drones in society. That being said, 3 questions. First on harms, second on regulation, and third on the role of the government. So first, on the harms of drones. The first point that they brought up to us was that there's privacy infringement and erosion of trust. Well, first of all, I would just like to note that those techniques are already illegal. You can't just be a peeping Tom and expect no consequences to be dealt to you. But even, I'm going to take a step further. Even if that might exist, regulation on our side can help stop that. Because the regulation that we're proposing, ever from the get-go, our model was restricting the types of areas in which you can access as a drone. So insofar as right next to a building window is an area that we're going to restrict because it could result in privacy infringement, we're going to be really happy to regulate that as well. But finally, I just want you to think about it, because you can close your curtains and make sure that people can't spy on you through your curtains, right? Like, I don't know why you'd be changing without closing your curtains. That just seems pretty illogical to me.
Sir?
No, thank you. Second, try to talk about smuggling and terrorism. Well, the point here is that we punish the actions of smuggling and terrorism, not the methods in which you get to that end. Because their logic was that cars are used to, for suicidal drivings. So therefore, cars are also this means that we can use to perpetuate terrorism. So does that mean that we should just ban all vans because vans can be used to help terrorism? That just doesn't really make sense anymore. But what do we tell you?
Sir.
We told you that no, thank you. Bad people are going to be bad people either way. Because the premise of being a terrorist is that you don't care about the laws. Because if you cared about the laws, you wouldn't go around murdering everyone because that's against the laws. But the implication of this in this debate is that they're going to find alternatives to kill other people. That means things like you're going to use knives to kill these people, they're going to use guns, or they're going to be choking these individuals, so by that logic they also have to ban physical contact and all of that as well. Sure.
Look, if your defense for why my neighbor can walk up to my window and use a video camera to record me is because I can shut the windows and close my curtains, how can your side claim you care anything about privacy at all?
Wait. Why would you not close your curtains if you're changing? That doesn't make sense. And beyond that, if you're that creepy and you're just walking up to a window and filming inside, you're obviously going to get prosecuted, right? That's just literally how the legal system works in the status quo. But I'm going to give you further analysis on why the alternatives that terrorists are going to go to is going to be far worse when you completely ban drones. Because note that it's quite easy to make a drone. All you need is a motor, a rover, and a bag that can like hold anything, right? That means that it's going to be hard to counter those drones when you have no way of actually tracking those drones, no thank you. And that means that there's going to be even less accountability under their side. The only response they gave to us was that, well, these drones are going to be of lower quality, right? Well, first of all, that's not really true, because I'm pretty sure that illegal manufacturers in the status quo still have heaps of money, and insofar as these terrorist organizations really want to buy this, they also have a lot of money that they can then give to those illegal manufacturers, so then they can produce higher quality goods. But even if these goods are like of very, very low quality, note that under their side, that you don't have any form of regulation or any form of defensive mechanism against these drones. Because you're living in a reality where you think that people no longer have drones, they can't like use terrorist attacks, no thank you, in the form of drones. Well, that means that even if you have a very, very poorly built drone, you can just simply fly it in, and because there's no defensive mechanisms around, then you can just detonate it anytime you want, and because there's no defensive mechanism, that's going to hurt society even more. Now, the third government speaker tried to tell us that what are the benefits in this debate of drones? Well, besides the fact that the benefits don't really matter, I'm just going to like bullet list out a few of them, right? Like more efficient delivery services, like helps agriculture. These are just like, a few things that the drones uniquely bring to the table. Now, second question: does regulation of civilian drones actually work? The first government speaker told us that, that regulation doesn't happen in the status quo, so therefore it's not going to happen anywhere else, and that it's not preemptive. Well, that's not true, because talks are already going on in society. We're already having this debate. There was already a sufficient public awareness of this issue. But beyond that, I'm going to note that they're also going to be preempting the people that want to do good things. They never gave us any response as to why it was justified to take away the freedoms of us individuals that just wanted to use drones for like filming purposes for themselves, or like Hollywood stars that wanted to make better movies. They never told us why taking away those rights at the expense of like maybe dealing out with some terrorists as something that is truly justified. Now they also try to say something about how like these drones are hard to track and it's hard to delegate responsibility. Well, then how did you track down these drones in the first place? How did you ban them if you don't know where they are in the first place? That doesn't really make sense. So in order for them to actually ban it, then they're going to have some mechanism to know where these drones are in the first place. But I'm going to give you some analysis on why our regulation actually works. Because note that most citizens in the society are law-abiding. So that means they will register for these drones as long as there's a legal means of still having them. The only response that they gave us was that, oh, cars also have like legal means of registration, but vans are still used in suicide bombings. Well, that's why we should increase the amount of regulation on the driver's license instead of just banning cars completely. That means that we should be punishing those people instead of just saying that cars in general are something that is very bad. The comparative on their side is that you have illegal manufacturers that don't care whether or not these drones are actually legal or not. Last question on the government's role. Note that we live in an age in which technology and the advancement of it is crucial to the well-being of all society. That means that even in the status quo, even if we can't really completely regulate all these drones, which are like probably going to concede, we know that it's better, at least that when we have this awareness, instead of banning it, we try to push forth some form of reform. Because in the world on their side, the government has like no awareness of any potential catastrophes that these drones could cause. Only on our side, when you legalize these drones and you try to push forward a means of regulation and defense mechanisms to prepare for those things, are the way that you can actually help society. The implication of this is that on their side, you set the precedent of banning every single technological advancement simply because it has a small potential of being weaponized. At the end of the day, we told you that just because something might be weaponized does not mean that we should ban it. Very proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 5 seconds. I believe you have 1 minute for it to prepare for your reply.
Oh.
Or you guys going straight to the reply?
I didn't know that the floor says you have an extra minute.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay.
That's on me.
No, it's
It might be confusing this with a different format. Okay.
Three questions, and this extremely strongman, contradictory, and merely infactual debate. Firstly, about the efficacy of both sides' policies. Second of all, regarding civilian use. And thirdly, clarifying the burdens of this debate and telling you why the proposition never fulfilled those. But firstly, on the efficacy of this policy. Two things to say about this. Firstly, ever since the very first speech on our side of the House, we told you they have contradicted themselves regarding the premises of both sides' policies. With their side, they said for them to ban, they probably have to be able to track the drones, to shoot them down, to be able to limit them, to be able to see who the owner of the drone is, to punish them in order to enforce a ban from the first place. Then logically, we should be able to assume that we can track and identify these drones too for our regulation purposes. We tell you that all their attack on how Arts and House can't regulate these drones, we can't track them down, and we can't regulations while they can ban drones and enforce punishment just doesn't make any sense because there's contradictory since the very beginning. We tell you that this content is irrelevant from their side of house. But second of all, the criminal actions is what they want to punish in today's debate. That is why they give you examples like terrorism, they give you examples like bombing, they give you examples like invading privacy. Because these actions, in and of itself, the end is already a criminal action that we want to punish. They're not punishing these individuals because using drones itself is immoral. What does this mean? This means that even with this additional piece of legislation that, quite frankly, is punishing people for the wrong reasons, because the use of drones itself is not immoral, but the fact that they're using it for bad purposes is immoral, then what we tell you that they actually already have legislation and punishment that is the same quantity and scale in the status quo. When you use anything for terrorism, we try to punish you. When you use anything to invade privacy, we already try to punish you. So we don't understand why with their side's policy, with the same form of punishment, but with just one extra article of law, people will suddenly change their actions, and thus we tell you they have no impacts from their policy. But secondly, onto the problem of civilian use, right? We already characterized to you, which they never engage with, about how civilians usually abide to the law. Because there is a possibility, since they are speculating about civilian usage, that when we're driving a car, we can go rogue and we can just bomb and we can like rush into buildings or we can like go over the speed limit, but we don't because we do follow the law. Because as a rational citizen, we usually do the cost-benefit analysis and we don't want to face the punishment of when we break these laws and we have to face the fines or the jail times. Then we tell you that it is the same with the drones, right? They will be able to understand legislation. They will be able to be disincentivized to do wrong things. We tell you they never engaged our characterization as civilians are rational people. But leisure is the majority of use for drones and toy cars and stuff like that. That is why tanks are an irrelevant analogy because these people who own tanks, majority of those people are using it to do harm or to use rogue actions, while toy cars and drones mostly are for leisure purposes. The exceptions are the ones who are terrorists. This is the fundamental difference. Thirdly, clarifying burdens and why proposition never fulfilled their burdens. We want to say opposition's burden was never to prove to you there's significant benefits regarding the use of drones. Because the default is that we shouldn't take away your freedoms to do anything unless there's significant harm. The burden of the proof is on their side of the house to justify why the government can infringe upon people's rights. Again, we tell you the status quo, like for instance, we allow eating junk food, we allow alcohol, we allow amusement parks. These things probably do more harm than good in any instance if you weigh it, but we still allow it because it's people's fundamental freedom, and in the majority of cases, we think the harm is negligible. Then we need to tell you that they need to tell you why there are unmitigatable, unique harms that stem from the civilian usage of drones, which we told you they did not say any of these things. Firstly, on terrorists, right? Terrorists never cared about the law, which is why we tell you that this is irrelevant in this debate. Like, even if you make it illegal, they're still going to do whatever they want to do harm. Like, it literally doesn't make any sense. But then they say, well, if it's on market, it's bad. Well, we tell you that it's actually better that it's on market, because if it's on market, the government can regulate it. If it's not on the market, it's in the black market, it's behind closed doors, the government can't do anything to limit the access to drones. But also, we tell you that the drones on the markets can't hold a bomb inherently, right? These people already modify the drones anyways, which is why we tell you there's no difference. Like, either side of how terrorists will be modifying and building their own drones, this is not the debate. Regarding accidents or like reckless individual use of drones, we told you why we have education, we have license systems to get rid of these possibilities, which again, they never engage in this very dismissive debate on their side of house. So in summary, this policy doesn't solve any problems, it just is an unjust way of infringing upon people's rights and making individuals more vulnerable than they already are. But also, you don't get to access any of the benefits that we already told you because we're engaging in the best case regarding how we can have a more eco-friendly, cheaper way of agriculture, we can have delivery systems that are more safe and on time. We thought these are the things that they do not acknowledge. With any new tech, it's revolutionary, we're scared, we get it, but we cannot make the mistake that's called side proposition. So proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 24 seconds. Can we now have the prop reply speech?
An opposition case. The more unresponsive and missing of the point it is, the easier it is to build, and yet the easier it is for proposition to defeat as well. So I'll be looking at this debate under two main questions. First off, on whether or not we should ban things in general, and more importantly, drones specifically, and secondly, whether or not regulation is actually sufficient. So first off, on whether or not we ban things. Because we would ask side opposition, if things like peeping were illegal, and therefore there was no need to ban a drone, would they therefore not make nukes illegal? Because murder is illegal as well, and therefore we can simply prosecute you whenever. We think that it was very clearly revealed in opposition second speaker that apparently they would pretty much never ban anything. That if I wanted to build up my personal military with an arsenal of tanks, then that is absolutely fine. We think that this shows a complete disregard for the huge risk that side opposition doesn't think about. Because this motion was never about the average citizen, it was about the risk of the people who lie outside the scope, who slip through background checks. It was about the question on whether or not your right to own tanks or drones or anything of that type of sort, which is very easily weaponized, was worth pretty much nothing against the fact that the owner of those tanks might have a psychotic break and therefore end up slaughtering thousands. Where side opposition would rather risk a massacre than simply cave to the demands of John because John wanted tanks. We think that moreover, it was incredibly telling on their side of the house when there seemed to be no point in actually keeping drones around for them, other than the simple fact that, hey, it's useful in order to take some movie shots, and moreover, there's this very flimsy layer that we should pretty much let people do whatever they want, a layer which was never properly analyzed or impacted. It was simply thrown around as bland rebuttal and rhetoric. So we would ask side opposition what exactly the harm of banning was on their side of the house, and more importantly, is that harm anything compared to the harms of terrorism, of people slipping through those cracks and wreaking huge amounts of harm on innocent civilians. But secondly, on whether or not we should ban drones specifically, because we think that opposition pretty much wanted to play analogy war with us the entire debate, because they never analyzed why a drone was more like a kitchen knife or more like, well, nothing, because apparently opposition would never ban anything, but more like a tank, which is something that opposition would ban. This is something that where they never drew the distinction. They never looked at characteristics of drones and why they were different or why they were similar. But side proposition did, where we looked at the fact that drones are unmanned, where we looked at the fact that they move in 3D space, where they're remotely operated, where they're easy to modify in the privacy of your home, and you have no clue what the intentions of the people who bought them are. And for all those reasons, we think it's a risk that is far too great for us to accept. But secondly, on whether or not regulation is sufficient. Why is this an important question to consider? Because we think that both sides of the house accept the logic that when there's a harm, it requires restriction. Opposition is willing to have harm and then have regulation. We think that surely if we prove that regulation still has harms, they need to step that restriction up a level and move to a ban. Because we explained on our side of the house why regulations simply don't work. When we gave to you 10 structural characteristics of drones and explained why those were so harmful, the fact that you can't trap them because they move in 3D space, that you can't prosecute because you don't know who's doing it, or you can't trace it, where it's not the same as a camera, it's not the same as a knife, it's not the same as a toy car. But moreover, we gave additional analysis on why regulations are simply so much harder, especially if their ministers are people who've never touched computers in their lives. We would ask how they expect them to handle something as specific and complex as regulations, as opposed to things like a blanket ban, which is so clear and obvious. When we gave them, furthermore, additional harms to regulations that were inherent, even if regulations were to some extent okay, when you have things like vigilantes who freak out and are paranoid and therefore create things like breakdown of community trust, when you have cases where markets simply drive up the fact that criminals and bad people are able to get better and better access to things that were already pretty dangerous in the first place. We think that yes, there might be drones on both sides of the house in the hands of bad people, but on opposition side of the house, those drones don't have the backing of $1 billion from investment, whereas on our side, it's simply some cheap PVC that's been duct taped together and has a motor and a camera attached to it. Ladies and gentlemen, we think the harms of regulations are clear, we think the harms of drones are clear. We demand opposition to do so much more to save the lives of citizens that they say they actually care about. So proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 2 seconds.
I have quite a bit to say. Do you want to just approach this from like just giving initial speaker feedback or just general stuff? Or